So please give a warm welcome to John Ronson.
Thank you, Mark. If people don't know, Mark was one of the founders of Maker magazine, which gave birth to the Maker Fair, and now works for the most wonderful website, Boing Boing, if people know that. Yes, that's Mark. I think this is an appropriate story to tell at a Maker's Fair, because this is a story not about me, but of a really great maker called Frank. But it's also my story. It starts in 1987. I was living in a squat in Highbury, North London, with a man called Shep, who would smash all the crockery every time Arsenal lost. I'd stand in the doorway and I'd watch him hurl the plates across the room in this fury, with his locked hair tumbling into his face like he was some kind of disturbed Highland Games competitor or Dothraki from Game of Thrones. And I would stand in the door and I'd think, he's so mentally ill. It was exciting. I dreamed of becoming a songwriter, but my handicap was that I didn't have any imagination. I could only write songs about things that were happening right in front of me, which is presumably why I ended up becoming a journalist. So one of the songs I wrote back then was called Drunk Tramps, which was a song about some drunk tramps I'd seen being ignored by businessmen. And it went, drunk tramps, ignored by businessmen. They walk right by you, don't even see you, but you're the special ones. Thank you. But it was evident that I wasn't going to make it as a songwriter, so I did the next best thing. I became the entertainments officer for my local college, the Polytechnic of Central London. And I was sitting in my office one day when my telephone rang, and I picked it up and I said, hello, and a voice said, Frank's supposed to be playing tonight, but our keyboard player's had a nervous breakdown, and so we're going to have to cancel unless you know any keyboard players. So I swallowed and I said, I play keyboards. And he said, well, you're in. And I said, but I don't know any of your songs. And he said, can you play C, F, and G? And I said, yes, which is lucky that my limitations matched theirs like a hand in glove. He said, well, you're in. Sound check, 5 o'clock. Frank's real name is Chris. Where's a big fake head? Then he put the phone down. So I did some research and I discovered that Frank was a man called Frank Sidebottom, who wore a giant fake head, and nobody outside his inner circle knew his true identity. So I turned up at the sound check at 5 o'clock, and there were some men fiddling with equipment at the front. So I said, hello. And they turned and looked at me, and I wondered which of them might be Frank, and would there be some kind of visual clue if you wear a giant fake head for a long time. And then I saw this other figure in the shadows turn and stare at me. And this is what it looked like. Oh. Guys. I've done everything right. Yay. Put it back. You had it. You had it. Whoa, did it come and go for the entirety of the presentation? Okay, so nobody move. Nobody move. And I said to him, hello, Chris, I'm John. And there was silence. And I said, hello, Frank? And he said, hello. He talked like that. And I said, maybe you can teach me the songs. And he turned away from me and kind of removed his head, almost like an act of modesty, like he was shyly undressing. And for a brief second, I saw some contraption underneath some complicated contraption that he seemed to remove very quickly, and then he turned back. And he taught me the songs, and they were indeed almost entirely in C, F, and G. This is what Frank sounded like.
I've got to have my way now, baby. All I know is that it's good. You look like you're fun to me. I opened up my loving arms and watch out, 'cause here I come. You spin me right round, baby, right round, like a raincoat, right round, right round. You spin me right round, baby, right round, like a raincoat, right round. You know you do, you really do. Thank you.
And it was marvellous, and I loved it. And before I knew it, I was on stage playing to 300 people, which was a sea of faces stretching out to the horizon. And the songs were indeed almost entirely in C, F, and G. And I was Alice going down the rabbit hole, and it was the greatest night of my life. Here I am playing with Frank. And after that, life went back to normal, and a year passed. And then suddenly I got a telephone call out of the blue from Chris saying, did I want to be in the band full time? And so I immediately quit college and I moved to Manchester. And nothing makes a young man feel more alive and on an adventure than speeding up the motorway at 2 o'clock in the morning next to a man wearing a big fake head. I'd watch him as the lights made his cartoon face glow yellow and then black and then yellow again. I just did something. Mark, you made it okay last time. There you go. Nobody move. Yeah, I'm going to have to oh shit. Really, for all the speakers. And there's no sense of outrage amongst the crowd. Yeah. I'm going to read a little bit of what I wrote about Frank. He was silly, unpretentious, homemade, marginal, innocent. He aimed low. In some ways, Frank was the opposite of Chris, especially the innocent part. Chris was hedonistic and prone to drink and drugs, but when he put on the head, he became like a child. And I think that's why he spent all the time inside the head, or certainly a lot longer than he needed to, because inside it was like a safe, marginal, innocent, childish place to be. And I know that some people around Chris thought that he was almost like a transgender person born into the wrong body, and that was the right body. In the van, I'd listened to Chris's stories, trying to understand him. What was going on inside that head? He reminded me of George Bernard Shaw's Unreasonable Man. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to him. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Chris was the unreasonable man, except the world never did adapt to him, and he never made any progress. Like the time that Frank was asked to support the boy band Bros at Wembley Stadium, and there was 50,000 people in the crowd, which was his biggest audience by 49,700. And it was his chance to break through to the mainstream. But instead, he just spent the whole time doing terrible Bros cover versions and was bottled off stage after 10 minutes. So he loved to portray it all as chaotic and haphazard, and the more accident and failure prone, the better it was. But I think it was more complicated than that, because that first day, when I'd looked at everybody's faces, trying to work out which one might be Frank and might there be some kind of visual clue, it turned out I'd been onto something, because underneath the head, to keep the voice, Frank would wear a swimmer's nose clip, which dug into his nose, and he'd stay as Frank for so long that it had actually deformed his nose out of shape, dug it all the way in, and after a long stint as Frank, I'd see him remove the nose peg, and he'd wince in pain. So being Frank was painful. Also, if it was all just a joke to him and none of it mattered, then why was he up all night in his shed building Frank things like this? And also that. He wasn't the only avant-garde outsider artist on the Northwest Manchester circuit in the late 1980s. There was also Edward Barton, who was a quiet, bearded man who'd stand on stage and scream, "I've got no chicken, but I've got 5 wooden chairs."
I've got no, I've got no, I've got no, I've got no chicken. Have a chicken. Where's my chicken? I've got no chicken, but I've got 5 wooden chairs.
He was the son of a Royal Air Force officer, and he kept all his possessions in a tiny satchel that he kept clutched to his chest at all times. And one time we dropped him off in his neighbourhood, which was a desolate housing estate in Manchester called Hume, where Nico from the Velvet Underground lived. And as we dropped him off, I saw him get out of the van, and all his possessions fell out of his satchel. I think the clasp broke, and they all fell onto the floor. And as we drove away, I looked out of the back window, and he made no attempt to bend down and pick up his possessions. He just stood there, just looking down. And it seemed to me like I was watching a man at the exact moment he'd reached his nadir. And from where I stood, this was completely incomprehensible, because Edward Barton and Frank Sidebottom, they were living the dream. For me, this was the dream. And I suddenly thought to myself, is this not enough? Should I be aiming higher? But the feeling quickly passed, because I was in the Frank Sidebottom band, and these were the halcyon days. And then the transit van turned the corner. And we would crisscross the north of England, playing to 300 people a night, sometimes 320 people a night, which was why it surprised me to see that there was a growing sense of discontent in the van. And the reason why was because everybody around us suddenly started becoming incredibly successful. So, for instance, my next-door neighbour had a band. They were called the Stone Roses. And our driver decided to leave us to try and make it in radio. And within a year, he was earning £35 million as Britain's most successful radio presenter ever. His name is Chris Evans. And even Edward Barton, who I'd last seen just staring at his scattered possessions on the floor, wrote a song for Kylie Minogue, which became a huge hit. And meanwhile, we were playing to 300 people a night, sometimes 200 people a night, sometimes 100 people a night. And then eventually he fired me for tax reasons. He owed £30,000 back tax, and he asked the judge if he could pay it back £1 a week, and the judge said no, so he fired us, and I moved back to London. And down in London, I became very successful. I started presenting television shows that celebrated wonderful, marginal, avant-garde people. And then after a while, I remember one day I was making one of these documentaries about some fascinating marginal person, and I was sitting in the editing suite and I was watching the editor cut together the craziest things that the person was saying while leaving all the ordinary stuff on the cutting room floor. And the result of this was that he was making this person not engagingly crazy, but kind of ridiculously crazy. He was turning this person into a caricature. He was laughing at this person. And I said, is this bad? And the editor said, John, think of it this way. One interviewee suffers, but millions are entertained. And he was right. Millions of people were entertained. The more we did it, the more we turned these colourful, marginal people into caricatures, the more successful we became. We were showered with garlands. And when I say we were showered with garlands, what I mean is that we were nominated for a lot of television awards that we didn't win. And one day I was standing outside an award ceremony where I just had not won an award. And a friend of mine, a radio presenter called Adam Buxton, came up to me and he said, "Do you know why we always lose?" And I said, why? And he said, you and me, can't you see? We're marginal. And I thought, are we? And he said, yeah, everything that we like, the people who like us, we are marginal. And I said, you're right, we're marginal. And I felt this enormous weight lifting. I'd been spending all this time frantically reaching for the mainstream, but I didn't have to. I was marginal. And I was spending all this time trying to be normal. I think what I was doing was I was saying, when we were caricaturing these people instead of celebrating them, we were saying, look at us, we are normal, this is the average. We were defining the boundaries of normality by ridiculing the people outside of it. And I didn't have to do that anymore because I suddenly realised I was those people, I was marginal, and it was great. And then suddenly one day, 15 years after I last saw Frank Sidebottom, my telephone rang. I was in the park with my son and I picked it up and this voice said, I said, hello? And this voice said, hello! And I said, Frank? And he said, oh yes. And I said, how are you? It's been so long. And he said, oh, I'm very well actually. And I said, Frank, will you put Chris on? And he said, oh yes. And then he said, hello. And he filled me in on the last 15 years. He'd retired Frank, but he wanted to stage a comeback. And I knew from watching the Blues Brothers what was going to happen next. But he never did ask me. Instead, he said, could I write a piece for The Guardian, remembering my time in the band? And he said he'd just had some new publicity photographs done, so he emailed them to me. And time hadn't ravaged Frank. He looked exactly the same. And so I wrote a piece in The Guardian, and then my friend Peter Strawn, a screenwriter who wrote the screenplay for my book, The Monasteric Goats, said there should be a movie. So together we started writing a movie, not based on Frank, but inspired by Frank. And the movie's out now in the cinemas. It's on VOD, and it's called Frank, and it stars Michael Fassbender as Frank. So have any of you seen it? A few people have seen it. Did you like it? Would you not say otherwise because I'm standing here and I wrote it? Yes, oh my God, that silence spoke volumes. In the middle of writing the screenplay, I went to see Chris. I hadn't seen him in ages. And I said to him, you look great, you look so thin. What are you doing? And he said, I don't know, it's just falling off me. And I said, well, whatever it is you're doing, you look great. And then we carried on writing the screenplay. And then one day I was on Twitter and I saw the words Frank Sidebottom dead. And I wondered why Chris had decided to kill off Frank and why Twitter cared enough to make it a trending topic. So I clicked on the link and it said, Frank Sidebottom creator Chris Seavey, dead at 54. And it turned out at that last meeting when I told him how well he looked and how, we wondered how he'd lost so much weight. Neither of us knew it at the time, but it had been throat cancer. And he'd been undergoing chemotherapy. And in fact, a couple of days before he died, he posted online a picture of Frank having undergone chemotherapy. And the day after he died, the Manchester Evening News said that he was going to be buried in a pauper's grave. So I thought, what does that entail? Like a journey back in time, 200 years. So I sent out a single tweet saying that for a few £1,000s, he could be spared a pauper's grave. And by the end of the day, 2,000 people had donated a total of £21,000. Frank had a lot of fans out there. And that was enough money to bury and exhume and rebury him half a dozen times. And the donations never stopped. There were a lot of people out there who loved him so much that they had designed their own Frank Sidebottom heads, like, and I think most disturbingly. And another collection was made to build a Frank Sidebottom statue that would stand in his local village. And we raised enough money for that too. And the organiser of the statue would send me photographs of its final journey from the foundry in the Czech Republic to its final resting place outside Timperley's Johnson's The Dry Cleaners. And in the photographs he sent me, Frank looked like he'd been disturbingly kidnapped, but was fine with it. And then the grand unveiling. And I'd spent all this time, I spent 10 or 15 years trying to deny my marginality. But now when I look back on Frank, and I think this is why, this is a place for people to experiment with making things and to create. And I think the message of this story is, it's okay to be marginal. That's a good place to be. And when I look back on Frank now, the story I remember most of all was this one gig we'd played in a place called Dudley, and it was very unsuccessful. There can't have been more than 15 people in the audience. And at one point, ignoring us, they split into 2 teams and started playing a game of football. And after the gig, and this is the moment I remember most about my time with Frank, he took off his head and he said, "That gig?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Best show we ever played." Thank you.